Do the pledge to the flag here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. I start with the Pledge of Allegiance because the reason that we're able to have this conversation today is we live in the greatest country in the world. And so I'm not going to offer you that at the end of the day we're all going to agree with everything that everyone says in this room, but hopefully we all walk away learning a little bit from each other. I know I'm going to learn a little bit from you. Hopefully you learn a little bit from me, meaning what I'm thinking, why I'm working on what I am. And I want to have a civil conversation. The rules are short. The rules are only this. I'm going to take the first 15 or 20 minutes or so just to give you some top line things that I'm working on in DC. We'll save the majority of time for you guys to ask questions. When you ask a question, two things. One, if you keep it to one question, that's better because I want to get through as many as we can. Two is if you disagree with anybody else in the room, that's fine, but don't talk to them, don't disagree with them while we're doing the program. You can have any comment or question you want to me, just not to each other. After it's over, if you want to have a whole debate on tax policy or anything else, you can stay here and have a coffee as long as you want to talk to each other. We'll keep it moving in that respect. So let's kick this off. Is this on? No, I turned it off. Let's see. There we go. So I just have a couple of things I want to talk about. I think there's two huge issues in front of us right now. One is what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. I'm going to come to that in a little bit. Two is the excessive spending and inflation that we're feeling here in Wisconsin and across the country. In the past 2 years, the federal government has spent new money, just new money that's being spent in the past 2 years, $5.8 trillion. $5.8 trillion on top of what I call like your ongoing costs. So that doesn't include Army, Navy, Social Security, Medicare, roads and bridges, health programs. That's new money related to mostly under the guise of coronavirus. That huge new influx of cash is the driver, in my opinion, of a lot of the inflation that we're seeing. So if you go to the gas pumps, the prices are up. If you go to buy groceries, the prices are up. If you buy a new or a used car, the price is up. It's up because we have pumped so much money into this economy, both the fiscal side, Washington, D.C. spending too much, but also on the fiscal side, which is the Federal Reserve bulking up their balance sheet. I'm of the view that we got to get our spending under control in Washington immediately because inflation's clobbering everybody, but it doesn't clobber everybody equally. There's two groups of folks that really get hit the hardest in inflation. So one is low-income workers. The second is seniors on fixed incomes. Why is this the case? Think about it. If you own your home and you got a 30-year mortgage, and inflation picks up, your mortgage payment doesn't change. Other costs do, your heating costs, repair costs to your house. If you're buying a new oven, your oven went up. But your costs are stayed reasonably flat. If you're a lower income worker and you rent, your rent may be moving from $800 to $900, $900 to $1,000, $1,000 to $1,100. And you're not getting anything more for that. And you got to figure out where you're going to figure out to bring in that additional revenue. That's on top of the fact that your groceries are up, your gas is up, your used car is up. So low-income workers are getting hit really hard. The other group is seniors on fixed incomes. Seniors on fixed incomes often have saved a little bit for their retirement. Those retirement savings are in pretty conservative investments because you're relying on that month to month. And that savings is not keeping up with the inflation rate. And the other side of that is that your COLA adjustment for Social Security, your cost of living adjustment in Social Security, never feels like it's keeping up with the rate of inflation. So you're catching a double whammy. And so when I think a lot about the spending that's going on in Washington, one of my big concerns is the impact that it's having on everybody, but in particular on low-income workers and seniors on fixed incomes. The other piece, before I cruise along, the other piece that gives me great concern is two key programs our seniors rely on, Social Security and Medicare. We're already behind the 8 ball coming into the pandemic. Federal government spent $5.8 trillion in new government spending, nothing to do with shoring up Social Security and Medicare. So in my opinion, they put those further at risk. So our seniors who are in retirement or approaching retirement age, who are reliant on those programs, we need to keep those solvent. They're promises we made, they're promises we need to keep. But to do that, we got to get our spending under control in Washington. Let's keep cruising along. Energy independence is absolutely essential for what we have playing out. We need it for a handful of reasons. One is the cost of energy, the cost to heat your house, the cost to fill up your car with gas, has a huge impact on living expenses, has a huge impact on inflation. But two, there's a national security component to this, that we need to make sure that we in the United States are not dependent on foreign countries for our energy. It's going to require an all of the above approach. It's going to require solar, nuclear, it's going to require oil and gas, and we need to do it immediately. The easiest one to turn the valve on is oil and natural gas. And so if you think back 15 months ago, day one of the Biden administration, they killed the Keystone Pipeline. That would have brought oil and natural gas in from Canada into the United States, giving us a North American supply of energy. But also, it had a huge symbolic impact on the broader energy market, saying, don't invest in oil and natural gas here in the United States. And it slowed that investment down against what it should have been. And it's made us, as a result, more dependent on foreign sources of oil. It has also driven the cost of energy up here in the United States. And so I'm of the view that we need an all of the above approach. In particular, we got to turn on the speed of which we're bringing online oil and natural gas. And it plays into the impacts of our national security with Russia, who is a major exporter of oil and natural gas. I'll get to that implication in a minute, but something I spend a lot of time on. If people want to ask questions on it, you can. As some of you may know, I'm the ranking member on the subcommittee on elections. I'm of the view that we need to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We need to keep key voter integrity provisions in place. My job in Washington, D.C. is all at the federal level. One of the things that I've been working against is H.R. 1, which would gut voter ID. I think it's important that we have things like voter ID to enhance integrity in elections so that we all feel comfortable at the end of the day that the results are the results. And so if people have questions on that, happy to discuss that as well. Securing the border. We have a huge humanitarian crisis playing out at our southern border. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are arriving illegally into the United States. I've been to the southern border twice. I've been to the U.S.-New Mexico border, which is actually where that photo is. I've also been to the Texas-Mexico border, to Del Rio, Texas, which is across the river from Acuña, Mexico. If you remember seeing a scene where there was a whole host of people walking across the Rio Grande in water that's kind of somewhere between knee deep and ankle deep. They were often walking along a rope line coming into the United States and then kind of sheltering underneath a bridge. I've been to that exact location. I've spoken to the members, the men and women of Border Protection about the challenges. I'm of the view that we need to do three key things, in particular as it relates to this. One, we need to support the men and women of Border Protection, and in doing so, we're understaffed and underfunded. And so we have jobs that aren't currently filled, and we need to increase the total number of men and women in Border Protection that we have on the job. And so we don't have enough men and women in Border Protection. We need to stand with these men and women who are doing gallant work trying to secure the southern border. Two, we need to invest in technology. In remote areas like this area, you'd want drones, you'd want motion detectors, so that an individual officer could go down and apprehend somebody who's crossed illegally. You're not going to be able to have a person every 10 feet. You're going to want to have enhanced technology. The other area you want that enhanced technology is at legal points of entry. So think about where truck traffic and regular cars are coming and going. We want to have technology that allows us to identify, is there some person in your car that shouldn't be there? Or two, is there any contraband or illegal substance coming into the United States that we don't want in? I'm going to come over to illicit fentanyl in a little bit. That is one of the drugs that is now coming across our border and is killing people at record rates. But I'll get to that. I'll get to illicit fentanyl in a minute. The third piece of the puzzle, in addition to the technology, is you need to have a physical barrier wall to allow the Customs and Border Protection agents to gain physical control and physical security and situational control at the southern border. You can't have any one without the other. You need all three pieces of the puzzle. I think it would actually do a lot to really improve the humanitarian crisis that's playing out at the southern border. And happy to take questions and comments on that as well. The second issue of the day that I think is actually the two top ones that I talked about is what's going on with inflation and costs here in the United States. The other is the situational and security concerns that are playing out right now in Ukraine. Ukraine is subject to an unjust, unprovoked attack by Russia. That's an actual photo that I personally took in the room while listening to the Ukrainian President Zelensky address Congress. Couple things at play here that I just want to touch on before, and again, if you want to ask questions on this topic, happy to discuss it in as much detail as you like. Two things are playing out here that I think are really important. One is we need to hold Russia accountable, and we can do that through financial sanctions. And so the U.S. has done a reasonably good job of putting in place financial sanctions to make sure that Russia is feeling the pain for the fact that they have unjustly and unprovokedly attacked the country of Ukraine. However, there's a $300 million gorilla in the room that I don't think is getting enough attention, and that's the fact that Western allies in the United States now is winding down their purchase of oil and natural gas from Russia, and I believe we shouldn't have any coming to the United States. But our Western allies, in particular Germany, are still highly dependent on Russia for their oil and natural gas. So total, between our Western allies, we are sending to the government and country of Russia $300 million a day for oil and natural gas. To put this in context, all of Russia's oil and natural gas exports total in a given year equal $60 billion. Russia's entire defense budget for an entire year is roughly $60 billion. A third of all government funding for the country of Russia comes from oil and gas exports. And while the United States had a small piece of oil coming in from Russia, our Western allies, again, think Germany, has a huge piece of their energy coming in from Russia. And so one of the challenges we face, while the financial sanctions have been productive, right, really altered the dynamic of the economic strength of Russia, we're still sending hundreds of millions of dollars a day to the country of Russia every single day. And until we address that, we haven't really addressed the gorilla in the room. And so I'm of the view that we need an all-of-the-above energy approach here in the United States, as we talked about, but we need to get to a spot where we're in a position to be able to export, in particular, natural gas, liquid natural gas, from the United States to our Western allies to reduce their reliance on Russia. We're not going to get them to zero tomorrow. They're wildly coupled. They've made horrific decisions over the past decade, making themselves dependent on Russian oil and natural gas, in particular natural gas. But we need to begin the process of unwinding that position in Russia with our allies as quickly as humanly possible, and that's going to be critical. The second piece, and I want to keep moving here, but the second piece I want to talk about, and many of you have heard of this, is in his request to Congress, but in the media as well, President Zelensky has repeatedly requested a no-fly zone over Ukraine. So one, what is a no-fly zone? What's my position on it? One, a no-fly zone is a statement from the United States or NATO working collectively to say you cannot fly aircraft or missiles over the territory of Ukraine. So it's one thing to say it, it's another to enforce it. So who would enforce it? So the enforcement would come functionally from the United States, directly engaging with the Russian military. So from a strategic standpoint, President Zelensky is correct to ask for that. That's something that President Zelensky would want. That's quite reasonable. From the United States perspective, now is not the time to provide that assistance. I don't think we should be directly engaging with the Russian military over the country of Ukraine. I think there's other tools in the toolkit that we can utilize. One is the sanctions, which is the financial sanctions have been productive. The energy piece of this still remains reasonably unresolved. I think we could put more effort there. And then the final piece is to continue to provide lethal weapon support to Ukrainian soldiers who are valiantly fighting to protect their country. And so I think those are the pieces of the puzzle I'd like to see us do. I don't think now is the time for the United States to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, because it would require direct engagement between United States military and Ukrainian military. And I don't think now is the time. Continuing on, I'm going to touch back a little bit here, but we have a crime crisis playing out. We see it play out in the city of Milwaukee. We see it play out in Chicago. We see it in other communities. I think some of the anti-police rhetoric we had seen over the past handful of years has had a significant impact on recruiting in our police forces, but also in how people think about their local police. I think it's imperative we stand with the men and women of law enforcement, that we're funding our local law enforcement appropriately, that we're holding criminals accountable for their actions. But let me jump into another area that I don't think we talk enough about, and this is what's playing out in our streets every day, which is illicit fentanyl. So pharmaceutical fentanyl's one thing, right? That's you get that from your pharmacist, you get that at your hospital. I'm talking about the illicit fentanyl. And what happens is illegal labs in China are designing a drug very, very similar to fentanyl that we call illicit fentanyl or fentanyl analogs. They're taking that, they're sending it to criminal gangs in Mexico. Criminal gangs in Mexico are mass producing this and then often lacing it, meaning inserting it into other drugs that are being sold on the street. If you look carefully at that picture, what looks like little grains of salt that would sit on the ear of Abraham Lincoln on a penny, that is a lethal dose of fentanyl. And so if you think about what this means, in the United States of America last year, 64,000 Americans died from an illicit fentanyl overdose. 64,000 Americans died from illicit fentanyl overdose. It's the #1 cause of death for individuals aged 18 to 45. Kills more people 18 to 45 than car accidents, more people than heart attacks, more people than COVID. And we're only starting to get the public to be aware of how dangerous it is. Many of our men and women in law enforcement know it all too well because they're on the front lines interacting where this is inside of our communities. I was in Racine just before this, but I also held a roundtable in Racine County talking about this same issue. Just in Racine County, which is obviously just south of where we're at today, last year 68 people in Racine County died from an illicit fentanyl overdose. And so I think we need to do a couple things. One, we got to hold China accountable. Two, you got to secure the border, and it's often legal ports of entry where these drugs are coming through that we're actually preventing these from coming in. They're often trafficking in from our area. They're often trafficked into Chicago, which is a major drug smuggling hub. And then from there it goes out and up the interstate system for us, up Interstate 94 through Kenosha County, through Racine County, into Milwaukee County, and then is being laced into drugs. And that much is a lethal dose. And you say, I've never heard of anybody wanting to go and get illicit fentanyl to get a high. They don't. They think they're buying other drugs. So in Racine County, I was with Sheriff Schmaling a couple days ago. He showed me his undercover police officers did a drug buy and got heroin, arrested the drug dealer. They tested the heroin and it had illicit fentanyl in it. The reason these drug dealers are putting it in and these criminal gangs are putting it in, it is wildly addictive, like 50 times more addictive than heroin. And so the drug dealer slips it in. They're trying to get you less than a lethal dose, but just enough. You take the drug, you are hooked, and now you come back and the drug dose that was purchased in Racine County was $40. You'd come back, buy $40 again, buy $40 again, buy $40 again, buy $40 again. But you can envision when they're mixing these drugs up, wherever the drug lab is, Chicago, Mexico, you name it, they're not measuring correctly. And the result is often people are dying from an overdose of fentanyl. And this is not going to be solved unless we raise awareness of the challenge of what happens when people are buying drugs on the street. This is totally different than where drugs were even 5-6 years ago. And it's a huge problem. It's something I spent a lot of time with my colleagues on in Washington. And I'm concerned you're going to hear more about it because we don't have our hands wrapped around the challenges that this is facing our communities. I want to end it here, and we're going to open it up to questions in just a second. I want to tell you two things. So one, I try to be available and accessible. We do town halls all over the place. I think we're in Muskego in this broader region before. We've been to Franklin, we've been to Oak Creek here today. I was in Sturtevant, I was in Clinton. We try to do these as much as we can. I've also added in telephone town halls so people can join. You can join from the comfort of your own home. And sometimes that's a little bit easier for folks. We get pretty good turnout on those. But also, never hesitate reaching out to me if you got a question, a comment, an idea. Call, email, write a letter. You got the contact information on the sheet that we should have handed out as you came in. But the other piece that I want to mention, is that where you or someone you know has a problem with the federal government of the United States, reach out to me. We can often try to shake loose the bureaucratic morass that's going on in Washington, D.C. to help you get the right answer. And so I'll give you just a couple of real quick examples. One, we've had people that have gotten into jams with survivor benefits with Social Security where name changes occurred and documentation was missed. Somebody's later on in their life as they lost their spouse and they're trying to get those survivor benefits. Our office can be of assistance. We've had people with issues as simple as a passport getting lost or delayed while they're trying to renew a passport because the passport agency is so backed up. We also had a woman come into our office and her husband had just turned 65, did not yet have his Medicare card, and had a pretty significant heart complication. And They went to the hospital, and the hospital wasn't willing to work with him in the way that maybe you would have thought, because he didn't have the Medicare card. She came to our office and said, hey, can you help us? We have a bat phone into some of these agencies. We use the bat phone. We got an emergency Medicare card. That night, her husband had a pretty significant surgery that was completed. We helped navigate through that, so it was paid through the Medicare program. She was so excited, she actually baked cookies and brought them into the woman who helped out on my team. We can't take cookies under the ethics rules, so we give the cookies back. But I tell you that story because sometimes you'll get in a jam with the federal government. It could be a whole host of things, or you know somebody that does. Tell them to give us a call. I'm more than happy to help. We jump in all the time. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the job, because with all the dysfunction in Washington, sometimes you can actually get something done for somebody, and sometimes it's kind of in the weeds. But let me tell you, if it's your husband or your dad that has a problem with Medicare, or it's your mom that has a problem with Social Security survivor benefits, it's a big deal, and there's nothing more fun than getting the right answer. You have all of our contact information. It's on the sheet in front of you. But I want to take this time just to really hear from you. Again, the only rules of the road: speak to me, don't speak to each other. So it's all right if you guys disagree with each other. We're not all going to agree with each other in this room. You can say anything you want to me, just don't dialogue with each other. We've had some struggles on that in other town halls. And the shorter your question, the more questions I can get through. And so with that, why don't we go? Susie's got everybody's name, so we'll just have Susie pull names out, and we'll go around the room. And because this is being broadcast on the Oak Creek channel, I'm just going to note what your question is, but we'll dialogue from here. Susie? Great question. Yeah, so the question is, how do we keep Medicare solvent? So we've got Medicare going into the pandemic was behind the 8 ball. And so we had a long-term funding challenge with Medicare. Then we entered the pandemic phase, and the government just spent another $5.8 trillion under the guise of COVID for a whole host of programs, some appropriate, some inappropriate in my opinion, but none of it to make Medicare more solvent. There's no single bullet that's going to solve the challenges that we face right now with Medicare. We wish there was a silver bullet. The hook here, the big hook to me, is to get our broader spending under control. And so I'll give you 2 pieces. So one is you got to get our total spending under control, so we're not going further into debt, which is putting at risk Medicare and Social Security, but Medicare, because it's your question, Medicare into the future. The other is working and finding ways to make the delivery of healthcare more efficient across the board. And that, again, doesn't have a silver bullet. There's no easy answer. If there was, we would have already done it, right? So in my view, there's no silver bullet, easy answer to making the delivery of our healthcare more efficient. But we have to continue to work to chip away at things that make it more expensive. So I'll just give you a quick example on the drug side, right? So take Medicare Part D, but Medicare writ large. We give companies who are investing in drug research a patent so that they can be the drug maker for some period of time, often 5-10 years. And then at the end of that, we open it up so that everybody can compete. More competition should bring the price down. What we often see is the case is some of these large pharmaceutical companies working to extend the duration of their patent protection longer than what we originally had set forth. And as they push that out further and further and further, it delays competition in the marketplace. And the delay of competition keeps the prices artificially high for far too long. We have to be far more aggressive on enforcing the actual patent protections that they actually sunset when they sunset, so that that competition comes into the market. We want people to invest. We want them to have that, which is why you get a patent protection in the first place. But then as you come out of that, we got to drive that competition forward and do it quickly. The other piece, I think we have a real opportunity to continue to drive forward on the price transparency, so that people understand what the prices are. It's different. If you get hit by a car, you're not going to go in and price negotiate, who's going to fix my broken leg. No, I get it, right? So again, not a silver bullet, but a piece of the puzzle. But the areas where we have good price transparency, so say LASIK, you'll drive down the street and people advertise what the LASIK price is. You may not want to go to the least expensive LASIK provider, right? But you're not going to go to the most expensive LASIK provider. You're going to do what any rational person would do, which would be a price-benefit analysis, and kind of think it through and say, what is the right place to go for me? You're going to talk to your friends and neighbors about quality. You're going to look at reviews online, but you at least know what the price is going in. right? You're not going to just take the cheapest guy on the street to cut your eye, to make your eye vision better. But you should be thinking about what the cost structure is in this investment. Again, not a silver bullet, because there's situations where you're not going to be able to make that decision. Again, if you've gotten a big car accident, which I did once in my life, you're just going to go. But we got to keep chipping away at this. There's a handful of bills that are out there. For example, those two that I offer you. And we're going to have to keep chipping away at it. And then the other piece is getting our total spending under control, in part because if we get to a spot as we go any further down this hole that we're going, is going to continue to jeopardize Social Security and Medicare. So great question. I'll give you the twofer. No. Totally, it's an appropriate question to ask. So if you look at just in the past, 15 months, early on, I'm gonna go big picture, because I think it's a good conversation to have, because we've been in this position of spending way too much for way too long. I mean, this isn't any one party, this isn't any one person that's done it. We've watched this play out for far too long. The difference is now we're seeing the ramifications that we're warned about for generations. People said, if you keep doing this, inflation is going to move. If you keep doing this, you're not going to have flexibility to this, right? All these warnings. We're now seeing more and more red flags coming up saying you're kind of at this spot. So early on in COVID, we had government mandates forcing businesses to close. We were petrified we were going to have a total implosion in the economy, that people were going to lose their jobs, be unable to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, cover a grocery bill. And so Congress moved through a huge spending package. Now, the government had to move through that in a sense, right? It was by no means a perfect bill, but it did prevent people from losing their homes. It did prevent people from not being able to cover a grocery bill while their business where they were employed wasn't open. As we've got through that, our priorities, the federal government's priorities began to shift away from being focused and tailored into the problem before us into a whole host of new areas. And so earlier, about a year and a half ago, year and a quarter ago, Congress spent $1.9 trillion on, quote, COVID, where only a small portion of that was actually directed toward COVID, but a huge portion of that was a whole host of other programs. I voted against that bill because I didn't like the whole host of other programs. No problem if we want to enhance our testing, if we want to make sure, therapeutics are available to people. We're talking, those are billions of dollars. The federal government, spent $1.9 trillion. We got to work to drive this down. And so it's going to be clawing back as much of this new government spending as we can, preventing new government spending from coming in. And the government budget that just went through increased spending, rough math, 6%. We can talk about what that means in the federal government, but it increased it. We just have to stop the runaway spending in Washington. It's going to be a huge challenge to get us to focus and tailor it. And I'm working with my colleagues to do it right now. Other people's priorities have more votes than my worldview. And I get that, but that's what we're kind of battling against in Washington. Thomas, go ahead.
You're talking about making the elections easier to vote in order to change what other states or even state like Wisconsin is doing to clean up the voter rolls and kind of fix what happened in November 2020.
Great question. Rich, do you have a water? Can I ask you to sang me water? This is like my third town hall, and my voice, I don't want it to go out before the total end. Great question. So what we watched play out in the elections last time, I think there's areas for improvement. I think the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty actually does a very good job laying out what took place in Wisconsin and where those areas are for improvement. My role in Washington is all at the federal level. So I think we're well served by having a state-run election system across the United States, so that each state controls their own elections. Wisconsin is very local on how we operate our elections. What I am concerned about at the federal level is that we're going to see a federal takeover of our election laws. So if you look at H.R. 1, it does a handful of things in H.R. 1. One of it guts voter ID provisions. I think voter ID is a very reasonable voter integrity provision that allows people to vote, but allows us to know who is voting and where they're voting. And it allows you to have a nice clean record of who cast a ballot. I think that's a reasonable protection. H.R. 1 would gut out voter ID protections. HR 1 would allow federal dollars to go towards politicians' reelections campaigns. So a lot of my time is spent at the federal level, kind of preventing a federal government takeover elections. At the state level, I think there's things that we can do to continue to enhance the integrity of our elections. We can do that without making it hard to vote. We can do that in a whole host of ways. Cleaning up voter rolls is a piece of that. Again, HR 1 would make it harder to clean up voter rolls. I think you want to have a nice understanding of who's in your community, who's voting, have the record of it. But I think as we look back, if we look backwards, I think the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty report actually does a pretty good job laying it out. It's pretty thick. If we can get you, I can send you an email with a link to it if you haven't seen it. At the federal level, I spend a lot of my time really making sure that we don't lose voter integrity provisions by a federal mandate. Good question. Great question, and I appreciate you bringing it up to all of our attention. Israel is in a challenging location, in particular as it relates to their national security. I've been to Israel. I've been at the border between Israel and Lebanon. I've been in the Golan Heights overlooking Syria. I have been in the West Bank, and I've met with political leaders of the Palestinians on my visit to Israel. I've been in both the West Bank as well as in Israel. It's a huge challenge. Where is the U.S. role as it relates to Israel? I think is really important. So the funding that's provided by the federal government is for the defense of Israel, in particular Iron Dome. So Iron Dome, for people who may or may not be familiar with it, is a defense design system that can shoot down rockets that are incoming. It's a defensive military investment. It's not an offensive military weapon. So if a rocket is being shot at Israel, which often is occurring from either historically. Yeah, I got you. I just want to walk through everything because I think it's important in the context of what we're discussing to understand the security investment that the United States is making as it relates to Israel. The United States is making a security investment to make sure that Israel has the defensive posture to prevent attacks from being carried out that are carried out on a regular basis from a whole host of terrorist organizations that surround the country of Israel. So on a regular basis in Israel, rockets are being shot into civilian areas. And no, let
Interrogating 12-year-old children, that has nothing to do with security, okay?
so
That's the complete opposite of security. You're creating more terrorists if you do that.
Understand, President. Let me just walk through the structure where the U.S. investment is, then we can talk about the allegations of human rights abuses. And that is where the investment of the United States of America is being put, because I think there's a lot of disinformation, not from you. I think you've said it accurately, but I think there's a lot of disinformation out there that what the United States is funding. What the United States is funding is the defensive investment for Israel so that they can prevent themselves from being attacked by terrorist organizations that want to remove Israel from the face of the earth. Now, the United States does not fund actions that you've alleged today. I'm happy to review the materials you brought.
Congress that wants to stop our tax dollars from going to these specific things, demolishing innocent people's houses.
There's not, with all due respect, there's not U.S. tax dollars that are going to removing people's homes in a foreign country.
Accurately tracking all of it. Why do you think these bills are in Congress for? To promote and protect human rights of Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation, to ensure that United States taxpayer funds are not used by the government of Israel to support military detention of Palestinian children and destruction of Palestinian property, to prevent our tax dollars from being used. This is a current bill in Congress from Betty McConnell.
I'm more than happy to review the bill you brought. Well, I'm happy to take the papers that you brought with you today. I'm just sharing my concern is with the protection of those in Israel who are on a regular basis under attack. That's the U.S. role for investment. Happy to review the bills you brought, but I do think it's important to stand with the democracy of Israel. Yeah, I'm happy to take it. Yeah, I'm happy to review it. All right, I'm happy to give it a review. Thank you very much. Susie?
You talk about all this new spending. And it's just a small percentage of COVID related. Has there ever been a push to have these bills kept to the related topic?
Oh, I wish.
So you don't have all this extra organic on.
Great question. It's probably my biggest frustration of all that's playing out in Washington. So here's the dysfunction in Washington. And then what happens is somebody has an idea for spending that all of us in this room, or the vast majority of us, and probably all agree with, regardless of our political position, right? Would say, yeah, we got to invest in X, Y, or Z. You got to invest to, make sure we got testings. We got to make sure we have the resources to protect the most vulnerable during COVID. We've had other instances, post 9/11, right, where you had to invest in certain protection of the United States of America. Then as soon as that bill is going through Congress, everybody says, yep, when this is brought up for a vote, it's definitely going to pass. Somebody adds in a special pet project. And then somebody adds in their special pet project. And then somebody adds in their special pet project. And by the time you're done, you got a busload of bad ideas attached to one reasonable and good idea that started the whole movement in the first place. And then we in the House, and I don't control the House, you might not know. I don't control the House, but I get an up or down vote on the final package. So if we go back to the first coronavirus bill, where again, federal government is shutting down people's operations, right? So the federal government is, and governments writ large are closing businesses. And so we say we got to step up to make sure people don't lose their homes. People aren't unable to pay a grocery bill. And then all of a sudden people start shoving all sorts of stuff into this bill. There's $25 million for the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. It's a theater in D.C. It's a lovely theater. It has nothing to do with the purpose of the bill. And so I had a bill to take out that $25 million. You can't get a vote on it. It is the complete dysfunction of Washington. But sometimes it's also called out. So there's instances where people are made aware of what's in the bill and it still moves through. So if we look back at the $1.9 trillion that was passed on a partisan basis under the guise of COVID, now just over a year ago. And so I voted against that bill. I raised the attention that only a small piece of that was actually going to address COVID. And here we are now a year later, all this spending went out. $350 billion of that went to state and local governments to spend more or less as they saw fit. It bailed out a bunch of states, in particular, that were making bad fiscal decisions historically. And now here we are, and we're short. You're going to hear a lot about this over the next 2 weeks. We're short, rough math, $15 billion for testing and therapeutics for COVID, right? So our most vulnerable still battling through this. Most of us have been blessed and have gotten to the other side, but we want to just end this COVID thing. We're short $15 billion. We wasted trillions of dollars that had nothing to do with COVID, and it's driving up inflation. Your short answer to your question, though, is we should have a far better process in Washington for how we get votes on specific pieces of legislation so that we can actually carve out all this wasteful, unnecessary spending. And it's a huge problem that we face. We have to rewrite how Congress spends money. And I could geek out with you for like 5 hours about how we do that. I'll just give you like 2 quick nuggets on it. One is in the state of Wisconsin, we budget every 2 years. So in the state of Wisconsin, every 2 years we do a budget. It slows it down. In Washington, we do it every year, but we're always behind. So 2 weeks ago, Congress passed the budget for the year that started 6 months ago. So they're 6 months late. So the next budget's due in 6 months. Of course, that'll be late. And so what you have is this never-ending spending cycle. You just got to slow it down, spend, and then actually review how that spending went. That alone would be a huge step in the right direction. And the other is everybody threatens to close and shut down the federal government. Wildly unproductive, actually costs more money to shut your federal government down than it does to keep it open. And because of that threat, it's like a game of chicken. Right? If you ever rode your bike when you were a kid, not real smart, right? You'd ride your bike at somebody else and it's a game of chicken. It'd be who would pull away first to prevent a crash. And people do that, and then they threaten, if you don't pay for my program, I'm going to crash into you. You'd say, well, if you don't pay for my program, you're going to crash into me. And only Washington, D.C. is the solution to pay for both programs. And so we got to pull away that easy default lever of threatening to shut down the federal government, which happens on a continuous basis, and a whole host of other ideas to dramatically improve the spending process, which is wildly broken in D.C. I share your frustration. Dan. Thank you for being here, Dan. I'm looking at you the whole day. I didn't even see you or say hello. Thanks for being here.
But anyhow, my question is more of a home-based thing, seeing as your district borders the Great Lakes, largest source of fresh water on the planet. We have rising water levels. We have contaminated soil, not just us, but everywhere along the coastline. Former administration suspended or stripped out funding to preserve the Great Lakes. That's been since put back in. We need immediate help, $7 to $10 million now.
Mayor, great question. Thanks for being here. One, I'm going to dig in. I'm going to take it as a homework assignment to dig in on the. I didn't know the liability issue, that it's a local issue after the federal government is involved in that. Yeah. Right. Yep. Interesting. I'm going to take. Totally understand what you're saying. I did not know that provision of the law. So I'm going to take that as a homework assignment to go look at. Two, we have shoreline erosion challenges all along the Great Lakes. They've been historically high. They're actually down a little bit, but they've been at historically high levels for quite some time. We see this along the entire lakeshore of Michigan. One of the things that I've been a proponent of in particular is funding our Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And so the GLRI, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, to make sure that we have funding in there to protect the resource of the Great Lakes. So this goes back to where are our funding priorities at the national level. So we see a whole host of spending programs being put forward. GLRI is a great resource that I've been pushing for us to actually make our full and thorough investments in. And then the final piece here is the struggle, is as the federal government has dramatically spent so much money over the past 2 years, we're gonna have a hard time finding new resources going forward. We're so far behind the 8 ball on total federal spending, but yeah, no, I'm not doubting on the validity of the program at all. And I've been to the location you're talking about. And so, but let me take that home and kind of think about how we can continue to enhance GLRI, in particular as it relates to lakeshore erosion and the environment of the lakes. The lakes here are in Wisconsin writ large, but in Oak Creek in particular, is a huge resource. I mean, it's what partly makes this area of the state so absolutely beautiful, is the Great Lakes, and we can't lose that as a resource for our community. Let me, if I can, let me dive in with you in particular on that specific project, and I'm going to brainstorm a little bit about what else we might be able to do. Yeah, appreciate it, and thanks for being here, Mayor. Patrick.
My question has to do with my pension.
Are you at Delphi?
I am.
You guys got hosed.
We got hosed big time.
Yeah.
And it's ironic that this meeting is here.
Yeah.
The same property that I work and hundreds of other people work.
Yep.
A lot of salary people, 20,000 total, throughout the country lost their pensions. I work for a very small union. I was not UAW. We're not topped off like the UAW.
Mm-hmm.
We lost our pensions in 2009. Had it for two years. And they took it away. It's not like I ever had it. They took it away, 2009. Our union was so small, we had no clout. Nobody fought for us. Our union did not have the financial resources. There is now a bill that was presented, Susan Muffley Act, to preserve the salary pensions. Are we also a part of that? The smaller unions that were left behind and not taken care of? Are we part of that?
Part of that bill?
Part of that bill also? Because I can't get answers anywhere I go. I don't know if I'm part of that or not.
That, offhand, I don't know the answer to your question, but what I'm going to tell you is I'm going to take, if I can, I'll take your name and number before we leave, and I'll get you a definitive answer to that. Offhand, I don't know. Very familiar with the issue. It sounds like you and a lot of your colleagues got completely hosed as that process went through now over 10 years ago. 15, 14 years ago, as that went through, a whole bunch of people here in southern Milwaukee County really took it on the chin. And I think it's even emotionally more challenging because the person that you might have been sitting next to at work who found themselves under a different union, different organization, was made completely whole.
What even makes less sense than that is my own union brothers, some of them were made whole. It all depended when you retired. It made no sense.
Mm-hmm.
Employees that
Yeah.
in my union, they were taken care of.
You say it better than I could because you lived it. It's wildly unfair what happened. You got completely the short end of the stick on it. I've been reviewing this legislation. I've been talking with my colleagues across both sides of the aisle about how we address this issue. There's a whole host of us that this is top of mind on. Let me do two things for you. One, let me get your name and number so I can go back to you specifically as it relates to your nuanced question. as it relates to your union. The other is I'm going to continue to try to find a solution for not only yourself, but for the countless others that have found themselves out of a pension. Yeah, appreciate you being here.
Congressman, thank you for being here and your comments about sanctions on Russia and energy independence. I wondered also, with the humanitarian things going on, millions of Ukrainians, women and children going into Poland. Poland has been very generous, very welcoming, taking care of these people. But I know the Polish resources are also at the limit, at the breaking point, and our own government sends mixed messages. One day the president says everybody's welcome, open arms, and then Ukrainian people don't know what to do because they can't get tourism visas, they can't get immigration visas. Is there anything Congress can do so that to relieve the pressure on Poland that some of these people with immediate relatives in the U.S. may be able to come here and not wait 2 years for a visa interview kind of thing?
It's a great question. I don't know if your wife had to step out.
Step out, but,
Yeah, yeah.
I'll let
No, absolutely. And if I can I share? Yeah, your wife is from Ukraine, and no, I don't. No. I just mean I wanted to publicly address how heartbroken we all are for what's playing out in Ukraine. I got a chance to say hello before she had to step out, but for the challenges that countless innocent people are feeling in Ukraine, I think they're all in all of our prayers as we see the destruction that's being wrought by an unjust and unprovoked attack. The humanitarian side is incredibly complicated. President Biden's going to be in Europe this week. He sounds like, last I saw this morning, is that he's actually going to be making a visit to Poland as well. As you correctly note, Poland, I think, has brought in over 2 million refugees. Other countries in the region, including Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, have also brought in countless hundreds of thousands of other individuals. Many of them are receiving work and living permits in those countries bordering Ukraine, some of which allow them into other EU states. The U.S. Legal and illegal immigration system is completely bust. We talked about the illegal side. The legal immigration system of the United States is equally broken. I think you're going to see a handful of bills come through Congress. I think you're going to see potential for a review of temporary protected status. So an individual that is already here in the United States from Ukraine, maybe on, say, a J visa, which is often like a college student that comes here for the summer, works in the Wisconsin Dells. That'd be an example of a J visa student. An individual such as that would get a delayed or an extended amount of time that they're able to stay in the United States, so they're not, for all sorts of obvious reasons, not forced to return back to Ukraine. So that's one thing that I think Congress could be doing. Two is, I think you bring up a really good point on providing some efficiencies, in particular as we do asylum claims in the United States. One of the challenges, because we have such a broken legal and broken illegal immigration system, is our asylum courts are wildly backed up. So if we go, I'm gonna shift and then come back to you. If we think about what plays out on the southern border on a regular basis, many of these individuals, the hundreds of thousands of people who are coming, are making asylum claims. Out of those number of people, a small fraction, less than 10%, are actually having claims that in the end become validated. But because there's such an overwhelming number of people who claim it, the asylum courts are wildly backed up, meaning 3, 4, 5 years in some cases before an individual can have their asylum case heard. We need to dramatically improve the speed with which we're processing asylum claims. In doing so, we would then have the capacity for people who have what I would consider fully legitimate asylum claims. So one could obviously envision an individual coming from Ukraine who stood up for democracy and pushed forward against the atrocities being committed by Putin, who would have a completely reasonable and legitimate asylum claim that they fear for their safety. That's really easy to comprehend, that there's countless individuals in that capacity that would qualify for U.S. asylum under current immigration laws. But under our current immigration system, the backlog of asylum claims is so long, think of it 2, 3, 4, 5 years in some cases, because of the crisis that's played out at our southern border for a number of years. And so I think we have an opportunity to really improve the asylum claims process in Washington, which would free up some of the capacity for individuals to get to the United States. I think you're going to continue to see resources put forward by the federal government to support the countries that are in proximity to Ukraine, which is probably where we can get the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. Poland is overwhelmed, and understandably so. Poland has brought in 2 million people in a country, that's population is way less than the United States. So it's a huge influx of people coming into Poland. And so it's a reasonable spot for the United States to continue to provide resources to make sure that Poland remains stable, as well as other bordering countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania in particular. And so I think there's a handful of things that we can be doing on the humanitarian side. I think a lot will actually probably come out of this Biden visit, both with our NATO allies as it relates to military engagement, NATO allies as it relates to humanitarian engagement, and then 3, what is the role that we can be doing in the United States, as you said, to improve efficiency in the process. But although your wife had to step out, let her know that our prayers are with her and with her family and friends and others and countrymen in the country of Ukraine.
The last thing I'll just say is our Ukrainian friends always ask about those jets, those MiGs.
Yes.
We know they're asking for them, so
Let-
they want to pass that along.
Let me, if I can, because this is spending and what's going on in Ukraine are like 2 of the biggest things in my head right now. Let me just touch that, because I think it's really, it's worthwhile discussing, because it gets complicated, and I don't think in the sound bites you see on TV, it sounds easy. It's wildly complicated. So, 1, I talked a little bit about the no-fly zone. The MiG jets and providing lethal military aid to Ukraine, some things are easier than others. So a Javelin, think of it as a giant and hyper-sophisticated rocket-propelled grenade. It's wildly more sophisticated, but that's kind of the broader context. And you could train an individual to use a Javelin missile in a reasonably short period of time. I mean, if you go online, you can see what these things do. I mean, they're unbelievable weapons. We can transport those in. You can be used by 1, but often 2 or 3 men at a time. You can launch, you can get out. The sophistication of it is, if we took those of us in this room, most of us could learn how to functionally use that very sophisticated weapon in a matter of days. A MiG jet is not something that, barring somebody telling me otherwise, based on their skill set in this room, that any of us would be able to operate in a matter of days. This would be a matter of often years of training. And unlike the way we talk about this at the national security on the TV, is a MiG jet's a MiG jet's a MiG jet. But that's not the case. And each one of these jets operates on a different system, requires different tools for upkeep. And unlike a modern car, where if you went to the rental station, you went to get a rental car, you don't really need instructions on how to run the car. Sometimes it takes you a second to find the start button, and you kind of think, how do I shift the car and how do I plug my phone in? It's a little different. It takes you 4 or 5 minutes to get ready, and then you pull out of with your rental car. For obvious reasons, the MiG jet is a whole nother animal. And not only do you need to have the resources to get the physical jet into theater, meaning into the country of Ukraine, you need to have a whole team of people that can support the upkeep of that jet. So unlike a car where you might need to get your oil changed, and probably most of us in this room could figure out how to change the oil on any new car with the owner's manual within a short period of time, right? You might be able to figure out how to change the tire quickly. If you had to figure out how to change the oil on a MiG jet that you've never seen before, that is really complicated. And the upkeep that they're doing with the parts and the operating systems is wildly complicated. And so I'm supportive of getting these jets and being supportive. I just want to caution people who think that that is the end-all be-all, because while if you have a trained, sophisticated, fully operational team in place, they could receive the jets and utilize them functionally. If you don't have that in place, if we just handed a couple of us in this room a MiG jet, we'd just have a MiG jet sitting on the ground that would eventually get bombed out of the ground by Russia. And so I'm supportive of making sure we're providing lethal assistance. I think one of the biggest things that we could be providing is, in particular working with our allies, is enhanced surface-to-air protection in some of those key cities and key strategic locations across Ukraine. They have Stinger missiles. A Stinger missile is, which you hear a lot about, a Stinger missile is a surface-to-air missile, but it's really good at a really short range and a slow-moving aircraft. So think of a helicopter coming over you. A Stinger missile would be a pretty good weapon to prevent that helicopter from continuing on. Less quality of a jet aircraft traveling at 30,000 feet in the air at the speed of sound. But there are surface-to-air missile capabilities that could actually take out a fast-moving jet at a high altitude. Long way of saying to your short follow-up question is that I'm supportive of making sure we're providing Ukraine with resources. The sophistication in working with our national security advisors on getting that right to have the biggest bang for the buck is pretty complicated, but overall supportive. Yep. I'm looking at time. 3:30, so we're 10 minutes over. Let me tell you guys, I appreciate everybody coming out. I want to continue to do this. I'm not going to offer, we walked out of here all agreeing with 100% of everything that everybody said, but I definitely learned from you guys today. Hopefully you learned from me, and appreciate you all coming out. Never hesitate giving me a call, shooting me an email, sending me a letter if you got thoughts, ideas, suggestions, comments. And do walk away remembering that if you have a problem with a federal government agency, or you know somebody that does, make sure that I'm one of your first calls, because there's nothing truly that I enjoy more than shaking loose the right answer from our federal bureaucracy. Mayor, thanks for being here. Thanks for giving us use of the facility. And thank you to our security officers as well who are here keeping us all safe. So thank you. God bless. Have a wonderful day.